Thank you, Mr. Chair. Um, I wanted to ask several questions related to the President's proposed budget and the cuts and your views on how we might respond. So, for example, if the cuts were to go through and we had the Ebola crisis, how would we be able to respond to that? One thing Ebola taught us is that the crisis might have been in Africa, but it could quickly come to our shores. So if a 30+% cut did go into effect, how would we be able to respond? Ambassador Burns, any of you?
One of the reasons we were successful in Ebola was the U.S. military and its work with the State Department on the ground in the 4 countries affected. I include Nigeria because there was a near outbreak there. And this nexus is so important. Every president, when they do their budgets, has always tried to integrate defense and the State Department and aid. This budget doesn't do it, which I think is one of its main weaknesses.
And so I wonder, how is the State Department functioning now? So, for example, you mentioned that they're not assistant secretaries. I worked very closely with the Assistant Secretary for Africa. I know there's not one in place now. I don't understand why the sitting Assistant Secretary wasn't left in place until a new secretary could be appointed. I don't even know who to call.
Well, Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield was one of our great Foreign Service officers.
Yes, I agree.
I have enormous respect for her. What happened over the last 2 months is that several of our most senior and experienced career diplomats were asked to resign. They weren't asked to leave their current jobs and then perhaps be available to serve elsewhere, asked to resign. It's an enormous loss. You know the names. We all know the names. And that's a great mistake. And to be near April and not to have a leadership on the 7th or 6th floor of the State Department, it doesn't make sense for the interests of the Trump administration. We want the President to succeed, but he can't succeed, cannot, if he doesn't have a State Department leadership in place.
And it's my understanding, too, that some of them just went ahead and resigned before they were asked because they saw the writing on the wall, including her. So currently we're dealing with famine, and I have introduced a bill to respond to the famine that's happening in South Sudan, although it's other African countries, too. How would we respond?
Well, you know, as the chairman said, there are 4 countries at risk of famine: Yemen and South Sudan and Nigeria and Somalia. This is unprecedented. And what you need in an emergency situation, we saw this in the tsunami of 2004, the Haiti earthquake, you need to have trained people who are on the job, who can go into action in 24 hours. That's why the Ebola crisis was contained. That's why way back in 2004, it was the U.S. and Japan, India, and Australia that led the rescue effort to the people who were victims of the tsunami. You can't just create that on the fly. And again, I know I've said this a lot, but I do want to repeat it. The State Department is very different than Homeland Security and the Defense Department. We basically have people. And it takes decades to train a Linda Thomas Greenfield. You just can't produce somebody and hire someone off the street to do that job.
You know, my focus on Africa has been promoting trade, and I know that OPEC is due to be cut, and that's, I mean, that helps us promote U.S. business involvement, so I don't quite understand the rationale for that. I'm also concerned about the elimination of the African Development Foundation that specifically builds the capacity of Africans to do for themselves, which to me is exactly how our foreign aid should be. And I just wondered if you, if any of you, either of you had a comment on that. Dr. Krasner or Ms. Pletka?
We didn't speak specifically about it, but I think in everybody's testimony we alluded to the fact that there's a lot of support for OPIC. I do think that it's vital, again, to make the case about how OPIC works. What works in development? What works in development is not development dollars from the American taxpayer. It's private business.
Exactly. Excuse me before my time runs out. Have any of you talked to Tillerson, Secretary Tillerson? How is, I mean, because he doesn't speak to the press. So what is he saying? How is he doing his job, or not?
I have not talked to him since he took office, no.
Have either of you spoken to him? Do you know anybody that has? Then how do they say he's doing his job? Because I also don't understand why he's silent and won't speak to the press. So do you know anybody that's talked to him, and what have they said about how he's doing his job. Isn't he concerned that he doesn't have any staff? Kent, Ms. Pletka, you look like you know.
I am not the next Sean Spicer. I'm not going to speak for anybody in this administration, and I don't know the secretary or what he thinks, and I would never presume to speak for him. We have many of the same questions.
I wasn't asking you to speak for him. I was just saying if
the honest
anybody has
answer
a
is
clue. This is a mystery.
I don't know.
Dr.
What
do
can I
you
say?
mind,
This
Mr.
is
Chair?
an advantage and disadvantage of living in California. It's a long way from Washington.
Thank you very much, and let me remind our colleagues that one of our witnesses, Dr. Krasner, has to leave at noon, and if you could hurry, you got 5 minutes, it's yours, but if you could use a little less time, it'd be easier for the rest of your colleagues to get a chance to ask the whole panel their questions. And I ask now, I go to Mr. Donovan.